So welcome to this session on the role and responsibilities of museums in a changing world and a changing climate. My name's Nick Fraser. I'm the Keeper of Natural Sciences at National Museum Scotland, and I am joined here by an illustrious panel of experts, whom I'll introduce you to in a minute. So, as we've heard so much today, we have unprecedented loss of biodiversity, degradation of environments, and it's all sort of woe and grief going around. What we want to talk a little bit about is the natural science collections around the world, but specifically in the UK, because in them is trapped some amazing scientific data which helps us and is helping us understand how the world is changing, how it's changed in the past, obviously, and potentially how it will change in the future. And the UK museums in particular are rich in specimens from around the world. Globally, they are very, very important, and they extend back 200, 300 years. So in these collections is the potential for us to understand what has happened in small areas over periods of time and see how populations have changed, how we've had invasive species come in. And so it really is, in our collections, the opportunity to really involve the public, get them to really understand and feel confident that they can engage in the issues that are going on today. And so that's what I think we're going to try and home in on today. Investigate the ways that museums with these natural science collections can work together and to support each other too. So can I just check, how many of you feel you have natural science collections in your collections? Okay. Okay, so you know all about this. And by the natural sciences, I think it's everything. So it's geology. It is the mineralogy. It's the petrology. It's sediments. It's soils. It's plants. It's living collections. It's not just herbaria. It's all zoological material. So the natural world covers all those areas. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So with me today in the panel, I'm delighted to say we have Nicole Heller to my right here. She's a museum fellow and curator of the Anthropocene for the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. I think the first curator of the Anthropocene anywhere in the world. Nicole's primary research is concerned with the challenge of promoting biodiversity in the face of global changes associated with the Anthropocene. For the past 10 years, Heller has been working at the intersection of scientific research and conservation practice. She's worked at a variety of organizations, such as the Peninsula Open Space Trust, which is a land trust in California, Climate Central, which is a sort of media institution looking at communication between scientists and the general public. She's been a visiting professor at Franklin and Marshall and Duke University, has an incredible understanding of talking with the general public and the communication of climate change. So welcome, Nicole. Moving on to Henry McGhie. Henry McGhie is of Curating Tomorrow, a museum consultancy. For many years, he was the head of collections and curator of zoology at Manchester Museum. And from his youth growing up in the Highlands, Henry's always had a great interest in the natural world and in nature, and has had a particular passion for birds. Studied zoology, and then went into sort of being a field ecologist, looking mostly at upland birds. But he says that early on he discovered that behind-the-scenes collections had great potential for illuminating historical ecology. And I think here is the crux of what we want to be talking about today. And since that time, never looked back. He's worked in museums as they have undergone radical change. He embraces new challenges and opportunities and says he's more passionate about nature, museums, and personal choice than he ever was. So welcome, Henry. And finally, but not least, Paul Smith, who is the director at Oxford University Museum of Natural History and professor of natural history. Also a fellow of Kellogg College. Prior to coming to Oxford, he was head of the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham, as well as director of the Lapworth Museum of Geology. His geological and his research is looking at the interface between Earth systems and organisms, and actually goes back a lot into deep time, and he's probably seen all these crises before, way back in deep time. So welcome, Paul. And I would like to start by, I'm going to give each of our panel members a question to answer to sort of get them to tell you a little bit more about their interests and to look at natural science collections. And I'm going to start with Nicole and say, how can museums more directly address human impact on the environment? Nicole.
Okay, great. Well, it's nice to be here. Thank you all for being here. So, yes, to address this question, I mean, I think we have a serious, very clear obligation. I was talking with someone earlier, kind of remembering the spirit in which our collections were amassed was really cutting-edge science of the time, right, in the 18th, 19th century, early 20th century. And in that same spirit, we need to be sharing the cutting-edge science of our time, right? And that really is the issues that we're learning about, the really deep interactions, interconnectivity, interdependence of human systems and the natural world. So I think that, that's encompassed in the idea of the Anthropocene, which really is this concept that is both a scientific concept, emerging from Earth system science, ecology, geology, recognizing the kind of incredible changes that humans are collectively producing on all of our Earth systems. So not just our local environment, which we're all familiar with, the way that people and any species affects their local environment, but really altering the entire Earth system. So our climate cycles, our biogeochemical cycles, really the functioning of our planet, which is what is such a scary recognition because it emerges from our collective action. And so in that sense, it's, and we're diverse people on this planet, so it's not an easy thing to sort of notice and then take control of. But in addition to being this scientific concept, the Anthropocene is also a cultural concept and is being taken up by scholars and intellectuals and artists in every kind of different field. So it really is the zeitgeist of the moment, is recognizing this deep interconnectivity between human and natural systems. So I really think this is a fundamental moment to sort of really break down that natural culture barrier. And in that this applies, I think, in the way we think about our scientific collections or our natural history collections, and sort of probing at them more as many different ways we can kind of, this, I think, affects the way we think about the way we work with collections. So with these object animals, with these archaeological and anthropology collections. I work in a museum where those are all considered together natural history. And so the anthropology, that cultural, natural connection is sort of natural. I think there's a natural opportunity to explore those in a more integrated manner. And I'll talk just about a few examples of that. But so, I mean, my point is I really think we're in a moment where we need to think much more creatively about the way that we engage with our collections. As Nick was saying, that they're incredible sources of data, right, to understand how the world is changing, how ecosystems are responding. So many of the ways that we understand and have been able to validate the impacts of climate change, or that ecosystems are responding, is through collections, and they really provide the evidence, and continue to be we continue to be able to explore them in new ways with new tools. That is sort of endlessly interesting, and that's very important science to do. But I think that it's really important that we also don't sort of limit ourselves in this moment of time and staying kind of in a scientific box and sort of treating our natural collections as something that's just about nature, devoid of the human, but really think about these collections in more integrative ways. And I think that this would be really, really relevant, or I know that this is really, really relevant to audiences who are sort of hungry, I think, for new ways of understanding these issues. And so there's incredible stories that each specimens or these collections, they can allow us to tell, about the ways in which these collections were mounted, the sort of, even just taking a more post-humanist sort of perspective toward these non-humans, right? So there's been a lot of work in anthropology to think more ethically about how do we display human bodies, for example. I think those same kinds of ethical questions, it's really a moment in facing the Anthropocene, facing kind of the crisis of our relationship with nature and the way that we've sort of treated, objectified other beings and kind of treated them as others that we can sort of do whatever we want with. We've reached the limits of that way of thinking, and we have to kind of move toward a more ecological way of thinking. So that kind of post-humanist turn, recognizing the value of the other creatures that we live our lives in, the very social worlds that we live in. And by social, I mean social with a tree, social with a squirrel. And that, I think, taking that kind of perspective is a real new area of novelty to think about what would it mean to work with these collections where there's a little more thoughtfulness about the respect, the way you're engaging with these other beings. And I believe that will resonate with our audiences, to have these kind of honest, thoughtful ways of engaging, and will be novel. So I guess that's kind of my major point, is I think through this is, working with, I think we're really at a moment where we've kind of got to think beyond what I would call the sort of the established environmental narrative, right, where humans kind of destroy nature, and that nature is only pristine and good or healthy when humans aren't involved in it. I think that story is part of the reason that we're in this crisis that we're in. And so as I would think about this question of talking about human impacts more directly, I would even want to stay away from that notion of human impacts and kind of avoid the framing of humans impact nature, or, nature provides benefits to humans, but how can we kind of use our collections to tell a more entangled story, a more multi-species stories, and like I said, this kind of post-human or ecological perspective. Because my feeling is that will be very conducive. We really have a chance to sort of transform people's sense of what nature is, how they see it, how they see themselves within it. And that will really be conducive to developing our own capacity, as well as our community's capacity to live more sustainably. So I have a few more examples, but I don't know where I am in time.
Give me another example.
Okay, I'll give just one or two examples so that's kind of the sort of challenge that I would put in for our community in thinking about how we work with these collections and kind of looking for these stories that allow us to talk about a more positive relationship between humans and other non-humans. So just a few examples that have happened at the Carnegie. How are we starting to work with our collections in the context of the Anthropocene? We had a recent exhibit called We Are Nature, Living in the Anthropocene. You can actually explore it in a kind of virtual online environment if you're interested. And that was pretty traditional in that, but it kind of looked across all the collections, from all the different taxa, geology, anthropology, and tried to, and used objects to tell these big stories about changes on our planet. But what it did that was perhaps rather novel for a science museum is that it then, rather than kind of leaving you in this space of, oh God, we've really hurting the environment and this is gloomy and awful and I feel terrible, which people did admit to feeling quite awful, but it then ends you in a place where you are taken into a room where you can explore emotionally how you feel. There were opportunities to do art. There we had drawn from the Andy Warhol collection and had his art about endangered species. So trying to create a more emotional space for people to process this, and all the way taking to the end of kind of allowing people to commit to actions or engage with different community groups in our area for more positive ways they could get involved. So that's kind of one example. I'll just give one more. There was an artist, kind of to think more broadly about even not natural science curating, but we had a curator from Senegal who came via the art museum, and she was really interested in this. It was an exhibit called Dig Where You Stand. And so she basically she curated from the art collection and the natural history collection together and wanted to have an urgent conversation about living in a state of coloniality. And she did the exhibit using a rhizomal structure. So just a totally different kind of way of putting objects together in this space to look at coloniality, to look at, systems of oppression and think about our collections in that space. And it drew in a lot of animal specimens, including, and this was the most popular thing in the exhibit, was a bald eagle that had been shot down in a great battle, the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this eagle was sort of there, and it was just this it was this deep moment to sort of look at this eagle who had sat on this battlefield, and had witnessed this event in American history. And so I think we learned a lot from thinking about how that art curator worked with our collections to think about kind of different ways of putting objects together, kind of mining the museum to think and tell really different stories that is certainly resonating with our public in new ways. It's a kind of new way of thinking about these environmental issues. So.
Thank you. So moving on, and a slightly different question for Henry. How can museums, do you think, support research for biodiversity conservation in strategic ways?
Okay, thank you. So could I get the slides, please? Okay, so the image that I've got here is on the cover slide here is a collection of peregrine falcon's eggs in museums gathered through the 19th and the early to mid 20th century. And these are kind of the classic example of how collections have been used to help understand a changing environment and how the impacts of people on nature. So collections such as these were used to demonstrate the effect of DDT and similar pesticides on birds of prey. And by the same, just to flip that round a bit, the existence of collections like these actually enabled these questions to be answered. Without the collections, it wouldn't be possible to answer them. So I'm going to talk really in terms of how can we use these collections in a strategic way. So the IPBES it's a bit like the IPCC does for climate change, but it's to do with biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's an intergovernmental organization that assesses research. And they did a big assessment earlier this year, the global assessment, that finds these 4 headline findings, really. Firstly, that nature is in decline worldwide, that declines are accelerating, goals for conserving and sustainably using nature are well off course, and nature can be conserved and restored and used sustainably, but it will take a lot of change. And the thing that I would like to highlight here is just in terms of the relative impacts of different human impacts. So the biggest impact that people have is about land use. It's about agriculture, habitat destruction, forestry. Secondly, it would be over-exploitation, so extracting timber, fish, animals, so on. Thirdly is climate change, but that's unfortunately, that's arguably the most difficult one to deal with. Fourthly would come pollution, and then of the fifth would be the effects of invasive species. So I just wanted to highlight this because this is a scientific assessment that because we really should make our decisions based on well-informed scientific data. But the challenge with museums is that there's no underpinning framework of questions or hypotheses. Collections grew over the last 3 centuries in a random way, and then we try to kind of post hoc rationalize what they're all about. And then the museums and biodiversity sectors, research sectors, often have very little to do with one another. And so really the question then becomes, how can museums target researchers, policy workers, and site and species managers in a strategic way? And so I put together a project last year with some funding from the British Ecological Society, which was taking a particular model, which is called the 100 questions. It's actually, I'll skip on one. So the 100 questions were put together by a big group of scientists and nature conservation organizations, and it's done in an iterative way, and it's to say, well, what are the 100 questions? If these 100 questions could be answered, would make the biggest difference for conserving biodiversity. So this comes from the academic and nature conservation sectors. And then these 100 questions fall into 12 categories. I'm not going to read them all out. And then, so what I did was I put together a survey, which on the one hand was asking the biodiversity sector, research sector, which of these do you think museums could answer, or what would need to happen in order for them to answer these questions effectively? And in parallel, I had a separate survey that was targeted to museum workers, because if the two sectors don't have that much to do with one another, they just exist in a kind of echo chamber, with their own colleagues. There's a perception gap, and we need to build a shared understanding. And so of these 2 surveys, there were about just over 450 biodiversity workers. And these were around the world from 84 countries, and from many of them were the national representatives for the Convention for Biodiversity, a lot of other agencies, and so on. GBIF is an information portal where biodiversity information is gathered together. It's super important because it's where a lot of governments draw their information from. And 133 UK museum staff took part. And although that doesn't sound like a huge number, we have to bear in mind there aren't actually that many people in museums who work with natural history collections. There's been lots of staff losses, and so that's actually very good coverage. So some of this will seem like the blindingly obvious, but one of the weaknesses of museums' arguments is that they're often making them themselves. We need to have evidence, from people telling us themselves, rather than us saying, oh, well, this is all really important, this can answer this, X, Y, and Z. We need better data, better information. So what would make the difference? aggregated online databases of collections of information, specimen information, well-curated and accessible collections, let's face it, always good. But also, very importantly, is that like collections aren't just stuff, they're not just things. You need to have people who understand the nuance of what it is that someone is looking for. The thing is just the thing. You need the information that goes with it to make it useful. And then if we think about, if I can return to these 12 topics that I mentioned before, so it sounds a bit like 9 out of 10 cats now, but that's, never mind. 80% or more experts for each of those 12 topics think that museum collections have got a part to play in answering those questions. So if we can just flip that around a bit, if museums don't play their part, that means that those questions are less likely to be answered. And overall, it's a third of these top 100 questions rely on museums' contribution. And that's a kind of headline finding, I think. That's really, to me, is really, really important. And just to say as well that museums are the original big data. It's not just a question of taking the information from labels, putting it in a computer that goes on the internet, and then chuck all the stuff away. That's not how it works at all. Because the crucial thing is that the information is just what enables you to go back to these collections, check the information, the identifications, correct, so on, and then you might be taking a sample, you might be taking a measurement, you might be doing all these things, analyzing them for pollutants, all of the above. But there are a number of challenges which we all know museums face, is that collections aren't as visible and or as discoverable as they could be. So there's in this day and age, it's almost pointless a museum just having its information on a database that you might be able to search from that museum's website. That's hopeless. We need to find the way that that information gets out there. So there's a lot of discussion at this conference about decolonization. So one of the ways which museums with these collections from colonial period, from the 19th, early 20th centuries, one of the best ways that they can contribute to the development of a fair and just future is by making the information associated with those collections accessible to those who can make best use of it. There are undeniably far fewer natural history curators than there were 10 years ago, whatever term you want to use. People who work directly with collections, there are less of them. There are less people doing more and more and more things, and that is just, if you think about where that is going to get to, is completely unsustainable. There needs to be a thought there about what is it that we need to do in terms of how a museum can be sustainable through sustaining its collections information, its staff, and its facilities to make all of these things work. Little contact between the museum and biodiversity sectors, and with less people, that becomes an ever greater challenge. And the absence of a strategy that helps us work together, we will need to address. And that's me, so thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Paul, again, a slightly different question. How do you think that museums can act as brokers in engaging their diverse publics with current climate research?
I think we've heard some of the ways from Nicole and Henry, and you don't need me to tell you that we are living in strange, unusual times, and as we've fallen down a rabbit hole and ended up in a weird world of alternative facts and post-truth. And we've done so at a really critical time for environmental science and the engagement of our many publics with that environmental science. So a key question is, where can people go for reliable information about those sorts of issues? They can't easily go to the print media because you pay your money and you take your choice. The point of decision as to which print medium you're going to buy determines the outcome that you're going to read about. The broadcast media have different but parallel issues of balance. So museums, I would argue, have a really critical role to play, and I'd be very surprised if you didn't argue that as well. We've got that role because survey after survey shows that we are very trusted institutions. Now, we've seen through this weird world that that trust can falter and that that trust is fragile, so we have to be careful. But whilst we've got that trust, we should use it, and it's vital for communicating science, the science of climate change, and the science of other human impacts. So we have a role to play in articulating contemporary science research and contemporary science findings and communicating to the public. And there are many, many examples in the past couple of decades where we have failed to do that, and it's had unfortunate consequences, where scientists have failed to engage with the public who are funding their research. And we need to be careful, very careful, that that doesn't happen with climate science. And it's happened with GM crops, it's happened around vaccination, it's happened around smaller issues, more local issues, such as badger culling in the UK. And it's led to decision-making being led partly by the media, partly by social media, partly by gut instincts, and not in an evidence-led way. And I think that's a very dangerous situation to be in as a society. So museums have this major role to play. What can we do? We've heard from Henry some of the ways that research can begin to, aspects of research can come to the fore. And I just want to look at some of the ways that collections can help us with that research. We have sources of rich information in the UK and more globally that go back to the early 1600s. And we've certainly got very detailed records from the late 1700s onwards. So our collections span a range from pre-industrial to industrial revolution to post-industrial. So we can get long-term trends from our data. They're sitting there in our stores. We can get information about shifts in geographic range. We can get information about shifts in phenology, the timing of events in the annual calendar that aren't easily accessible by any other means. And we should be opening up our collections and finding ways, encouraging our researchers, even if they're not in-house, contact that local university, make links, find out what research your collections can be used for. Don't just let them sit there statically. The uses of those collections aren't always obvious. One of the bits of research that we're doing in the museum in Oxford at the moment is using dung beetles as proxies for biodiversity health, where native forest has been ripped out to produce palm oil plantations. That's going to continue to happen until the economic drivers stop it happening. But in the meantime, how can we minimize biodiversity loss in those palm oil plantations? And it turns out that dung beetles, just measuring the abundance and the diversity of dung beetles, is a really good proxy for ecosystem health. And it then turns out that there are really simple interventions that we can make. Just widen the avenues between the trees, allow cattle to graze, and you preserve biodiversity. So to do that, we had to rely on the collections, the dung beetle collections, for identifying and monitoring biodiversity. And there are many other examples where the use of our collections is not immediately intuitive. So we've got to get better at using our collections, but also, as Henry has just said, at linking our collections. We need to really integrate those sources of data. Other countries are miles ahead of the UK. Many of you will know about IPBES in the United States, 120 million specimens searchable last time I looked. Similar initiatives in France and Germany. Not as much happening in the UK, no national initiatives. One of the things that Nick and I and others in this room have been working on recently is bringing together some of the big regional collections in the devolved nationals, the large university collections, the large civics, together to look at how we might begin to have joint digitization programs. And linked to those joint digitization programs, we're going to need very good discovery tools. We can port things into GBIF, but actually, if we can use the power of the semantic web to develop new search tools, then we're going to be in a much better position. Our collections also have a really key role to play in public engagement, of course. Don't need to tell you that. And we need to take the research that is being done and translate that research, engage our public with contemporary science issues, not just tell old stories. What is the current research that's being done? What is the current science that's being done? I'll just give you a few examples of what we've been doing in the Oxford Museum. I'm not pretending we have all the answers. In many ways, we're a fairly typical medium-sized museum, but these are what have worked for us. 4 years ago, we launched a series of temporary exhibitions called Contemporary Science and Society, where we take an interdisciplinary theme that we think is of potential interest, and we develop it with large groups of researchers. The current exhibition involved input from 100 researchers across a variety of universities. We build the digital in, we wrap a very rich program of events around it so that it's not just the footfall to the exhibition, that's just the starting point. We attract people in to the events program as well. And we're beginning to get very good responses. The last exhibition on the natural history of bacteria, called Bacterial World, had 170,000 visitors to the events program and to the exhibition. We link all of that into our youth forum, who call themselves the Dodo Crew. And so they directly inform, and we engage with them to inform our practice. And as awareness of the climate crisis has accelerated over the past year or two, so our practice has accelerated. We've now established a climate forum that brings together specialist groups from the region, the wildlife trusts, the community-led biodiversity groups, and all of those come together and help to advise us on what sort of programmed events we should be running. And then most recently, we've reached out and begun to have a dialogue with Extinction Rebellion. And last Saturday, we had a handover of the museum to Extinction Rebellion for the day for an arts science festival that brought 6,000 people through on a Saturday, a really joyous occasion of lectures, of family activities, of environmental poetry, of lectures, and a whole diversity at the same time as raising awareness, not just of which organizations people could join, but also what actions they could take. So there are many things that we can do, and I'm sure there are many other examples around the room that we should share, actually, and we can all learn from each other, of course. What should we be careful about as we do that? That trust is fragile, as I mentioned at the beginning, and so we need to be very careful about how we project the science. We need to understand the science ourselves as museum professionals, and we need to communicate it accurately. As Greta Thunberg would say, listen to the scientists, and as Extinction Rebellion say on their banners, tell the truth. So we don't need to exaggerate the science. We don't need to hype the case. The science is really quite bad enough on its own. We just need to project it accurately. The test that I give my staff is what I call the polar bear test. So polar bears are the go-to icon of ecosystem decline, of rapid polar melting. Whenever the press have a rapid polar melting story, there's a picture of a lonely polar bear sitting on an iceberg in a blue ocean, normally quite thin looking. And it's the icon of a declining and endangered species. So hands up, which of you would be happy to use that icon to talk about rapid polar melting? You're very wise. We have no idea whether polar bears are declining. None. They're also not endangered. They're vulnerable on the red list, but in terms of decline, there are 19 populations radial around the Arctic. Of those 19 populations, we know that 7 are stable. We know that 2 are increasing quite rapidly. Only 1 is in decline, and it's one of the smallest of the populations. And the remaining 9, we actually don't have the data. So they could be in decline, but it's unlikely at the moment. That might change with climate change, but at the moment, we would be misrepresenting the case if we said they were a declining and endangered species. So don't exaggerate, and I don't think we should resort to cliche either. We shouldn't employ tokenism. We should do stuff, actually. To be more formal, we should take action, but let's just do stuff and let's engage people. We also shouldn't conflate climate change with biodiversity loss. At the moment, as Henry very accurately said, most biodiversity loss is habitat loss and degradation of habitat. So as I say, the science, the accurate science is grim enough, so we shouldn't overhype it. And I think, as Nicole said, we're going to depress people, and people will disengage if we constantly hammer home a negative message that all hope is lost. And I think what we really should focus on is that there is hope in this situation if we act, and that we shouldn't just rely on hopelessness. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all 3 of you for your deeply insightful comments there. And I am conscious of time, and I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, but I think I shall refrain for the time being and hand over to the room to see if you have any questions of our panelists. If you put your hands up.
Is that on?
Yeah.
You can, yeah, can you hear? Thank you very much. I've worked on climate change issues for quite a long time, and I'm well aware that for very good scientific reasons, we often talk about long time frames, long-term trends, and things like that. But I also now work a bit in the heritage sector, and I was very struck by the example of a Charles Rennie Mackintosh house that has become extremely vulnerable because of the changes in climate over the last 40, 50 years. And there was clear information from the Met Office about what had been going on in that particular location where rain had gone up 20%, for example. And do you think there's anything that we can do in terms of probing museum collections to show some of the changes that are actually happening in people's lifetimes as well? So, for example, the biodiversity reports that come out quite recently show big losses in some species since the 1970s. Is there, in terms of communication, something about emphasizing stuff that people are living through? Thank you.
Yeah.
So just to respond to that, and I think also to respond to Paul's point about the polar bears, is that we have this thing called the one world problem. We have one world that's affected by many different things. So the polar bears is a great example where polar bears, many populations are recovering from overexploitation. You know, lots and lots of them used to be shot. And the decline of polar bears is modeled based on, you know, we know that polar bears rely on ice. If there's less ice, the presumption is there's going to be less polar bears. But to take your point there, is that Historic Environment Scotland have done a brilliant job in terms of showing some of these archaeological sites on the coast of Scotland, you know, like on Skara Brae and Orkney and these kind of places, where they're on a cliff and they're terribly threatened by climate change. It has a very strong, it's very easy for the public to make the connection. Whereas when we're talking about things in museums, it's often not so obvious, well, what have museums got to do with climate change? So one of the things that I think they can do is to relate what they have in their museums from these coastal sites and so on. That's one of the ways to help people understand. So there's a thing called the Climate Heritage Network which will be launched in Edinburgh in October, in a few weeks' time.
Can I add a comment? Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely collections can bear on the very contemporary period. I mean, there's been, as you said, a lot of press recently of those, you know, the one in the German nature reserves, which I understand was a resurvey project, you know, run by a museum to show the decline in flying insect biomass over the last 30 years. And I think citizen science and engaging in that kind of work with our communities to look at patterns on the landscape today is a very, a good way of engaging. And there's lots of examples of that kind of work from different museums. But also, very much so with communication theory would suggest, or theory and practice, that starting with people's real lived experiences is a really good way to sort of start the conversation and to kind of shift from, so you could even imagine doing community curation, right, about people's, the lived experiences and the changes in their own lifetimes as a way to engage. Maybe people could bring in objects or stories, you know, and there are good examples of people doing that kind of work about, so I think that is an excellent way to engage people. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Nicole. Those two examples I gave you of even the smallest local authority natural history collections will have good evidence about range shifts over the last century, of geographical range shifts of different species, and of changes in timing of egg hatching and things like that. And those are tangible, and we can utilize those.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? I have a question which I would like to ask. 55% of the world's population now live in urban environments, in cities. So is that an ecosystem that we should be looking at as natural science collections?
Okay, so I'll say something to that, is that the idea that urban living is somehow bad and rural living is somehow good is very questionable. So as more and more people move to live in cities, leaving more nature behind is not necessarily going to be such a great thing, because the natural habitats that we have co-developed with people over thousands and thousands of years. So the species that are in those places, many of them are kind of codependent with people. But I'd just mention a project that we had in Manchester when I was still there, called From Grey to Green. So the argument used to be that, well, we know more about the wildlife of the 19th century in some ways, because lots of people were out looking at it. And there's a way to kind of segue into the last question, is that in a time of very rapid environmental change, it also presents lots of opportunities for people to get involved in recording, you know, wildlife recording. If you've seen an unusual insect or whatever, you can report it to a thing called Species on the Move. There's a Species on the Move UK. So like I'll give you an example. So in my garden, five years ago, we used to have 6 kinds of bumblebee on the cotoneaster bush. Now we have one, which is the invasive one, which only appeared the last few years ago. You can see these changes happening very, very fast. So that's what I would say.
And I think it's something about public perception as well. If that higher percentage live in cities, we have to engage them with the natural environment in those cities if we're going to be able to talk a language of, you know, why climate change and why biodiversity loss is important, because otherwise it is entirely intangible, actually. And so that is our route in as museums.
Just, yeah, building on that, I mean, as a conservation biologist by training, I mean, this is where conservation has gone, is that we have to think about the landscape much more holistically. So urban nature is, I think it's where people live and work, and so it's essential, but it's also essential to think about, you know, what's going on in cities and how can we incorporate natural areas better into our cities for both biodiversity protection, but also as a way to adapt to climate change and reduce our vulnerabilities. So I think it's this holistic set of issues that museums are really poised to help people think about. The term in the United States is green infrastructure. I don't know if that's what you use here, yeah. And that's often being driven mostly by engineering or urban planning, but that ecological perspective to really imagine what could those spaces be? How much ecology could they support? And of course, there are trade-offs. You know, if you start creating really good habitat in a natural area, that might become, you know, I can't remember the word, but you're drawing species in, right, who are only likely to get killed by a car or poisons. But that kind of rethinking the way that we develop and how we live with and engaging people as stewards in these systems, I think is really vital. We have a program called 21st Century Naturalist, where we're trying to kind of exactly engage our youth in urban areas with what is a naturalist in the 21st century. Different tools, going out in different places, you know, and I think that, you know, it's vital, as we were talking about the loss of naturalism overall, the loss of people doing this kind of work. It's, I think, engaging in the cities and rethinking what does exactly that look like, who gets to be a naturalist is a really great project.
Is there maybe something that we're missing out here on? So we have members of the public generally going out, they are interested in the environment, recording groups. Is there a way that we can link their data with the museum data? Is that something we do not do enough of? So that we're aggregating this data together so that recording groups feel part of this bigger community. Is that something that we fail to do?
So I think what I try to get across is that collecting and collections are not a thing of the past. You know, it's not like we've inherited this 19th century legacy and we're like, oh God, we're all struggling with how to digitize it. It's totally the wrong way to think about it. Collections need to be kept, you know, ironically alive by adding specimens to them. Otherwise, you've got no information. You know, and often we understand we can answer questions in retrospect. There's not just as things are happening, you can answer them immediately. So we should be continuing to collect. That gives people a role in not just contributing records, but informing new collections. That helps them understand about museum processes. It involves people in the museum operation, rather than them just be kind of spectators who come and look at stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think there's another question of, in addition to continuing the collecting that has been done for 100 years, 200 years, there's also a question, it's been touched on in other conferences, of are we actually not collecting the right stuff? Are we trapped in that 19th century collecting model? And actually some of the things we should be collecting to represent the modern era are not in our museums. One example that I've been working on recently is speleothem records, stalagmites and stalactites, which are now routinely used as paleoclimate records and are at least as good as deep sea cores and ice cores for determining climate tracks over the past 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, up to a few 100,000 years. Now, I wouldn't mind betting that very few of our museums have speleothem collections, but they are primary archives of paleoclimate data. And the people who are doing that work are actually just putting them in their laboratory cupboards and then throwing them away when they retire. So we have to look at the collections that we're not making.
Thank you. I think we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our three panelists, Paul, Henry, and Nicole, for an exceptionally stimulating discussion. Thank you.